Most of us know that the media sucks. The problem is, most people just simply don't have the tools to articulate why. People dispositionally who are liberal, they see Fox News. They know in their bones it's bad. But when it comes to dissecting some media that agrees with them, they usually just ignore it. Fox News viewers, they hate the media too, but they conveniently ignore the fact that the #1 cable network in the country is just as guilty as the media establishment that they hate. The reason the phenomenon is it usually goes surface deep. I believe is that people going about their daily lives simply lack the toolkit to understand the pernicious forces that lay beneath our media to shape their coverage, manipulate politics, and ultimately manipulate votes by getting people so worked up about the other side. They are blind to the crimes of the masters of the universe. Interestingly enough, the New York Times itself is out with an unintentionally revealing story, pulling back the curtain ever so slightly into why exactly our media is so awful, and how many pernicious forces use the terrible incentives within the business to manipulate the public at the behest of whichever interests they happen to be working on behalf of. Now, this story, it focuses on the infamous Steele dossier, which you'll remember as the document published in January 2017, which alleged collusion between Trump and Russia and the P-tape and so much more. It inspired probably more cable news segments than any other document in history. And as we all know today, it was completely and totally fake. As Matt Taibbi called it at the time, the Steele dossier and the reporting around Russiagate was the largest failure of the institutional media, perhaps even more so than WMD in Iraq. How did it happen? The Times details how Fusion GPS, which was a firm founded by former Wall Street Journal reporters working on behalf of the Clinton campaign at the time, invited, quote, selected reporters from the Times, the New Yorker, and other news organizations to meet Mr. Steele in Washington and to receive briefings on what he had uncovered about the Trump campaign and the Kremlin. Here's the catch. If reporters wanted to talk about it, they were instructed, quote, they had to agree not to disclose that Fusion GPS and the former British agent were sources of the material. Nearly all journalists complied with Fusion GPS's instructions, and even after everything became public, nobody was willing to investigate or do any real investigation into who exactly the characters behind the thing was. Furthermore, as many journalists published the allegations as near fact, they almost never issued retractions when piece by piece, almost every single claim within the dossier was proven completely false. Now look, I have no interest in resurrecting Russiagate to do yet another monologue on it, but only to show you in a context that you might recognize how so much of the news around you is being manipulated. The author of that Time story, who is writing a book on private spies and news, uses the dossier to demonstrate how, quote, private spying has boomed into a renegade billion-dollar industry, one that is increasingly invading our privacy, profiting from deception, and manipulating the news. He continues, quote, while I was examining the private intelligence business, it became clear I needed to look at another profession, the one where my career had been spent. Journalism. Reporters and private investigators long have had a symbiotic relationship that is hidden from the public. But hired spies feed journalists story tips on documents. You use reporters to plant stories benefiting a client without leaving their fingerprints behind. The information they peddle is often sensational. It can also, quote, be impossible to verify or be untrue. You almost never get high-profile journalists like this, not only admitting Russiagate was a farce, but peeling back the onion to demonstrate the pernicious forces that lead to so many failures. And if you think this is all about politics, you're completely wrong. Meyer points out to another totally apolitical situation where the media was completely manipulated by Harvey Weinstein. Weinstein famously hired former Israeli spies at a firm called Black Cube to spy on Ronan Farrow for investigating his own crimes, to dig up dirt on women who were accusing him of his predatory behavior, and more. They used this information that they gathered and laundered it through the media allies in the press, who would then go after the women and leave Weinstein to go and after another woman for another day. How about this one? Meyer began his story with another famous one, Theranos. Fusion GPS, the firm behind the dossier, was former Wall Street Journal reporters. It was then hired by Theranos to stonewall Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou, and they even mounted an effort to spy on Carreyrou and to try to get ahead of what he was finding out about the company, which eventually led to its downfall. I chose to spotlight all of this in this article today because I believe it reveals the very foundations of why so much of journalism is broken industry today, why corporate interests and bad actors are throwing billions of dollars at manipulating the people who manipulate the public, and they've become wildly successful at it. Journalism previously was codified by sets of rules around sources and more. They would have laughed at people like Fusion GPS out of the building 20 years ago. But today, they not only take the meeting, they end up regurgitating their claims. Screw-ups beget screw-ups. Nobody was fired for Iraq WMD at the New York Times or Fox News or anywhere else. That opened up the door for Russiagate. And now, with the Russiagators running the show, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists and more, the next Fusion GPS is waiting in the wings to manipulate the next story. Who knows what that is exactly, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to be good for the rest of us. And we'll have more Rising for everybody right after this.